Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the IOP's first speaker series event of the academic year. Are you MAGA or a socialist? A look at how their policies overlap in 2024. My name is Lucas Frisancho, and I'm a third-year political science major in the college. And throughout my first 2 years here, I volunteered at numerous IOP events with remarkable speakers. Today is no different, as we're pleased to be joined by two wonderful guests, Faiz Shakir and Mike Needham. Faiz is the founder and executive director of More Perfect Union, a nonprofit whose mission is to build working-class power through journalism, advocacy, and education centered on American laborers. In August of 2021, More Perfect Union won the Sydney Award for its outstanding investigative reporting of the Frito-Lay workers' strike against the company's grueling working conditions. Faiz is also a senior advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. Mike is the former chief of staff to Senator Marco Rubio and the current executive director of America 2100, a nonpartisan nonprofit that advocates for policy to promote domestic industry, reinvigorate patriotism, and return pride and dignity to American workers. This summer, Mike was also appointed chairman of the conservative think tank American Compass. Moderating this conversation will be IOP senior director and former New York Times journalist Jennifer Steinhauer. Before we begin, please make sure to silence your cell phones, and after the discussion, someone will place a mic in the audience and there will be time for Q&A. Priority to the first questions will be given to students. Also, be sure to check out the IOP's website for upcoming speaker series events, such as Effective Activism Across Generations at 5 p.m. this Thursday, October 10th at Bond Chapel, featuring Congresswoman Barbara Lee, or What to Expect If You're Expecting Trump at 5:30 on October 15th at the Chicago Theological Seminary, featuring a panel of Trump administration officials on what a second term would look like from a policy perspective. Now, let's begin by again welcoming Faiz Shakir and Mike Needham.
Hi everybody, welcome to academic year 24-25 and the first IOP event of the year. We're thrilled everyone could come out. And thanks to you guys for hopping on planes and coming to join us today. We're really excited to have this conversation. I wanted to start us off by kind of setting some parameters about what we're going to be talking about today. This is not a conversation about bipartisanship. This is a conversation about contemporary policy intersections of the far left and the right, and the MAGA and the far left, which I think is probably, we can agree, is a subset. I know students think all the IOP cares about is bipartisanship. That's often true, not tonight. We're not talking about short-term spending bills. We're not talking about the debt ceiling. We're not talking about broadly popular bills like the infrastructure bill, in which both parties kind of work hard and negotiate in sort of an old-fashioned manner to bring policy together. What we want to examine are policy positions that not so long ago were associated pretty much strictly with the far left or the far right, or something in between but not the intersection. All of us on this panel are old enough to remember when free trade was a central position of the Republican Party, and beating up on corporate power was more the purview of the left. Donald Trump, I think we can understand, is not definitionally on the right on issues outside of some specific key ones, but more populist, obviously, and we understand that he's played a big role in this shift, but that's clearly not the only factor, and the shift isn't even limited to the United States. There's a prominent German politician who started her own party. I think she's really shaken up German politics, and she said recently, if you consider the struggle for social justice, for less inequality as something left-wing, then we're left-wing. At the same time, we're in favor of limiting migration, which is supposedly not so left-wing. So for many people, the categories of left and right are no longer comprehensible. So I think that's a great place to start through the lens of some specific policy areas. On my mind are antitrust, war powers, trade, immigration, wages. But before we get to my list, and maybe you want to hit one of those, I want to hear from both of you each to opine a bit in this frame about how you view this in time, in your time, all this time of working for Bernie Sanders, your time with Marco Rubio on the Hill. Is there a specific anecdote, a specific moment from each of you where you thought, wow, why is that person on my boss's bill? Or how do these two groups come together? This is getting weird out here.
Yeah, well, first of all, great to be here with Michael and Jennifer. Thanks for inviting me. It's my second trip back to your Institute of Politics, and I was telling people before that I went to Harvard and got my start at the Harvard Institute of Politics, and Chicago's didn't exist, and now that it does, I'm sure you're going to build a whole army of wonderful people who got their start at this wonderful institution, so I'm glad that it exists. My strange bedfellows, when Jennifer asked the question, I think the first thing that popped in my mind was we were in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and we were trying to figure out how to help and support people who were struggling. And Senator Sanders felt strongly that we needed to move stimulus checks out to people, and we were having a hard time talking to people within the Democratic Party about just cutting a check to people. It was a challenge because it's not something that a lot of Democrats were comfortable talking about, had language for, maybe even believed in, I'm not sure, but they weren't out there publicly talking about it. So Senator Sanders went out there publicly, started discussing it. And Josh Hawley was the first one who came out and said, I want to join this bill. And we could argue about what the motivations and intents were, but he followed through and carried through on that. And it was Sanders and Hawley who then got to a point where we pushed initially, if you'll remember this in the COVID pandemic, Trump is still president of the United States. And we are pushing for, at that time, $2,000 check. And I think both Hawley and Bernie agreed on that number and wanted it to happen. And it was whittled down to $600 is what we got, $600 in that first bill. And it mattered, and it wouldn't have happened without that support. And Hawley called up Donald Trump, who both supported it, but then also, as Trump tends to do, outflanked him and decided he wanted a higher number and said $600 is not enough, he wanted $2,000. And we're like, right, and we then advocated for $2,000, and it passed the House, didn't pass the Senate, so we settled for $600. And through that laid the basis, I think, if you follow that trajectory of that strange bedfellows, that push then became fulfilling that promise, right, for the rest of that check, became the core of a Democratic messaging strategy and policy strategy, such that when Biden is elected, he advocates that he will fulfill the rest of that check to everybody. And we go out to Georgia in the midst of this special runoff election in Georgia and say, please give us these two senators, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, so that we can deliver this check. And I think it was to my mind, one of the greatest examples where both the strange bedfellows existed, but also changed the trajectory of politics and policy in a pretty important way.
Mike, I would love to hear your anecdote, but I would first love to hear you respond to that. I don't know if you remember when that happened. Obviously, you're very familiar with Senator Hawley. I'm feeling like maybe he and Bernie Sanders are otherwise pretty much not going to do things together too often, and not someone that Democrats embrace. Do you remember that moment at all? And even if you don't remember that particular moment, what does that say to you as a Republican? How do you contextualize that?
Well, I think it does reflect some of the changes that are going on in the Republican Party. It also reflects the moment that we were in COVID. I mean, I cut my teeth in the Tea Party movement. The largest legislative achievement I had in the Senate was helping pass the Paycheck Protection Program, which spent $780 billion keeping small businesses alive. So I think there were a whole bunch of people on both sides of the aisle that were doing things in the midst of the COVID pandemic that maybe we didn't think we came to Washington to do, but were necessary in that context. The anecdote I was going to give actually involved Bernie Sanders and was Wednesday night before Thanksgiving in 22, when Misty, his chief of staff, called me and said the Congress is going to have to vote when we come back on a rail bill. The labor unions and the management of the rail companies haven't been able to come together on an agreement. Somehow the Congress actually has, with regards to the rail industry, the responsibility if an agreement can't be cut, to vote on a negotiated agreement that the president was involved in. And the vote had been voted down because the rail workers didn't like the deal that their labor unions had negotiated for them and had no paid sick leave. And you look into the industry, and this is an industry that in recent years has 50% profit margins, has become incredibly financialized, owned by private equity companies in many instances, has adopted a method of operations that is so focused on efficiency that you literally have mile-long trains, and yet the companies couldn't find a way in their 50% profit margin to provide paid sick leave to workers. If you had COVID, you were expected to show up to keep your job. And so got off the phone with Misty, called Marco, kind of talked it through, said, first of all, we have no idea why Congress has a role in being involved in this, but if we are, when you look at this, on the one hand, you have management that kind of in a cartoonish way doesn't seem to have regard for its workers. If you can't find room in a 50% profit margin business to allow that paid sick leave to exist, then what's happened with American capitalism? And on the other hand, you have labor union leaders who have negotiated a deal but have grown so out of touch with their workers that they didn't actually realize how important this was. And in all instances, or I think most of the instances, the unions lost the vote. And so that was, I guess it doesn't comply with the standard you set at the start, because the ultimate bill passed overwhelmingly, with both parties coming together and passing the deal with no paid sick leave for the workers. But it was an instance where a small number of us were able to do the right thing and vote in that instance.
In that situation, do you feel there was an evolution in either party represented in that instance, or an evolution in our country? Or could that have happened 20 years ago, that same exact scenario?
Well, I think there's certainly an evolution in my party, in the sense of my party has been a free market fundamentalist party for most of the last 30 years, and looks at this and says what the free market is capable of dictating the right outcome, and who are politicians or others to come in here and weigh in. And I think increasingly what we're seeing is that the free market will get you to the most efficient outcome. The most efficient outcome isn't always in the best interest of the country. And increasingly, when you look at our country, the lack of industrial capacity, the lack of worker power in some of these negotiations, there is a broader consensus that if we're going to have a free market economics, which is the most powerful tool for allocating capital and having the type of human flourishing that we want to have in our society, you need to actually pay attention to the parameters of the game, so that the power of free market capitalism is focused towards ends that are in the common good of the country.
Do you observe that the same way?
Yes, I mean, I worked at the ACLU as well for a period of time, and the right, not speaking for Michael, but the right in general in the ACLU tended to agree on the idea that one of the greatest problems of power abuse in society is government. Literally why we created the Constitution of the United States, why we have the Bill of Rights, is protect us from what we thought was the most powerful actors in society, which would be government. That's why we need freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of power, peaceful assembly, freedom to petition our government leaders. We need protections from this huge overlord. And what has transpired since, right? We now live in a society where I would argue corporate power, way more power in the government on almost any issues that you want to talk about. Where you talk about big tech, you want to go through the railroad industry, you want to go through any large major sector. It is corporate America who's dictating a lot of the positions that we in society are living under. So when you say, why don't we have paid sick leave? Well, it's not because, yeah, sure, we want the government to now guarantee, and we want Kamala Harris and the Democratic administration to do that, but one of the reasons we don't have it is because corporate America has decided you don't get paid sick leave. That's right, that's really the basis of it. So why am I working for a rail company, working 80 days straight, getting COVID, and they're telling me I can't have a day off? That's the world in which we live. I mean, we can go through the dysfunction of the entire healthcare industry, right? Health insurance, they're telling me that I have to pay a $10,000 deductible. Why am I paying monthly anyway? What the hell is this deductible? Why do I have to pay this? This is insurance. This doesn't seem to be insurance. Who called this shot? Who called this shot? Well, the corporate power did, right? So I think increasingly it is the case that the major fights of our time are taking on and trying to restructure markets so that they work for working people.
That's not a surprising viewpoint from you, but are you surprised by the way Mike framed it up? And are you surprised that the Republicans came together in that particular instance?
I mean, we kind of almost did and didn't in that one. I mean, I remember that vividly, covered it very intensely on Rail. I mean, this is actually where it helps that Joe Biden is president. It still matters that there's a Democratic president under Donald Trump. I don't know what would have happened, but you had the workers asking for paid sick days, and we got in the negotiated bill, at the end of the agreement, Biden parachutes in and says, I want some sick days for these workers. The companies resisted. They say, fine, we'll give you one. And literally that's what we got. So in the package, they gave them one sick day. And that was what was agreed upon. And then to their credit, after this was all approved through Congress and it didn't have the sufficient number of 6 days, they wanted 7. The administration, Biden and Buttigieg, stayed on the case, and one by one, it got to the point where now I think 85% of rail workers now have 7 paid sick days because they stayed on the companies to expand those and change those policies. But I think, in these moments, I see my own view, and I'm going to speak for Michael, but my own view is I see more rhetoric, I see more shifting, I see more desire to cater to and talk to working class people. But when it comes to policy actions, it's hit or miss.
Okay.
Often miss, in my view.
Y'all put us kind of in modern times. I'm going to go back to 2007, and I wasn't going to talk about this topic now, but I think I will because I want to look at more some seeds. So here's a quote on the Lou Dobbs show. I don't know why we need millions of people to be coming into this country as guest workers who will work for lower wages than American workers. I think this was in reference to a bill that was a particular minor obsession with au pairs and camp counselors. That was your boss.
Yes.
So that might surprise some of you. That's 2007. Is that the seeds of something, or let's talk about the current debate about immigration? Obviously, Trump realized needing more blue-collar workers in the Midwest. He found immigration as a great wedge issue in 2016. But is this the seeds of that? Talk about that.
Well, we can talk about immigration for a minute, but I would love to hear Michael talk about it so we don't bore the audience too much. But I would just say that if we're thinking about the immigration debate, it's largely become more about wall, border versus, pathway to citizenship and humanity towards people. And I think we're negotiating between these two lenses. And one of the lenses that's missed in the debate is the thing that Bernie Sanders was talking about and often isn't discussed is who benefits when you have exploitation of labor. If you look at Alabama or Mississippi and some of these places, you've got subcontractors, contractors of Hyundai, other companies who intentionally hire undocumented people so that they can pay them very low wages and exploit them. And that's not good for people. That's not really any good for anybody. And what he was arguing is that you want a system that doesn't cause slave labor exploitation. I mean, even to this day, if you look at prisons in Alabama, they provide, to this day, some of the labor of fast food restaurants and such. What kind of system is this? We can pay rational living wages to companies, particularly for companies like McDonald's or Hyundai, making billions in profits. You telling me you have to exploit low-wage wages to survive? That's, I think, one of the fundamental things that needs to be discussed in the course of immigration, because it is not just a security issue, not just a humanitarian issue, it's also an economic issue.
I look forward to Faiz and Bernie Sanders helping Donald Trump cut down on the mass low-skill migration that we have into this country. So we were in Charleroi, Pennsylvania 2 weeks ago, which is a small town of 4,000 people, 30 miles south of North Carolina. They have had 2,500 Haitian migrants dropped on that town in the last 2 years. How did they get there and why are they there? There is a company in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, it's a food packaging company, that could invest in productivity. When you look at the videos of what's going on in this factory, these are people sitting in a refrigerated room moving dishes from one conveyor belt onto another. The type of thing that could be mechanized, that could have robots, which America just lags so much of the OECD, so much of the rest of the world in adopting robotics, that would create high-paying jobs for American workers, making the robots, servicing the robots, monitoring the robots inside the factory. The factory owner doesn't want to do that. Instead, he goes to a service agency, staffing agency, which owns the 50 houses in town, stuffed 15 people into these 2-bedroom households. Homes, absolute, I think, human trafficking, who came from NGOs that worked with the Biden-Harris administration coming in. And so when you look at the way our asylum laws in this country are being abused to allow companies to rely on low-wage migrants instead of investing in American workers, when you look at the way H-2A, H-2B visas are, we have a mass problem in this country of low-wage, low-skill immigration, and I'm glad to hear that we have consensus that we're going to work with the Trump administration to stop that.
Except that we disagree on this one. So the problem that Michael just laid out is he went after Haitians, right? He discussed Haitians purposely.
Go after it, but...
Right. Well, the Haitians they were given temporary protected status. They're here legally, to be clear. Legal immigrants, right? In Springfield, where we had this huge debate, people eating cast dogs, obviously not true. And the whole idea was that they're people, Haitians, temporary protected status, legal immigrants, brought into a community to do jobs. They were at Honda, they were working at Dole in Springfield factories, fulfilling jobs by all accounts. Vast majorities, both of the companies, the communities, indicating this was hugely beneficial. And of course, there's some, when you have immigrants to America, this, for those of you who study immigration, this has happened to America for generations, right? Jewish immigrants, Catholic immigrants, Pakistani immigrants coming to America and introducing a different way, a different approach, they eat different foods, they do different things. That's been the beauty of America. It is the assimilation, it's the melting pot. And when I just resisted the notions that when legal immigrants come to America, do good jobs, work very hard, paid good wages. This isn't exploitation. This isn't slave labor in Alabama. This isn't undocumented people
so you don't think
at the Hyundai factory.
You don't think when somebody goes into a factory, because you started off when you were talking about this before, talking about these companies with their profits and how they're not investing in their workers. That's not a illegal situation. So what's going on in Charleroi is that the company is paying $16 an hour to a staffing agency that then pays the legal immigrants $12 an hour to do this. That's what's going on.
But somebody's going to take that job, right? Is my point. Somebody's going to have to work that job.
The lack of investment in productivity, the reason that we're not adopting robotics, the reason that we aren't doing the types of things that businesses have to do to create high-wage jobs in America for people who are here legally to do, is a result of bringing in low-wage labor. Whether that low-wage labor comes in illegally or legally doesn't change the equation of whether or not businesses face an incentive to invest in high-wage work.
I want to move on to other policy areas because we have a bunch, but it seems to me that there is still a fundamental agreement here. You're framing it differently, and you're talking about different groups, and you're talking about different industries as well. Because again, Bernie Sanders, as I recall, was very focused on au pairs, summer camps, bringing in Australian labor for concerts and things like that. But you're fundamentally agreeing that you feel there is an exploitative nature, that there's a wage depression issue, and policy experts can agree or disagree about whether that's actually true, but there's a wage depression belief on American workers that stems from immigration that both of your boss and your parties seem to have a long-standing somewhat agreement on. That may be surprising.
And so what we want to do is we want to align the incentives on the market to get the outcomes that we want. If we want high wage work that's available in America, so American workers, people here legally, can have a family wage, can support their family in a way that is not possible for too many Americans today. If we want to increase worker power, we need to reduce those things that are providing companies other ways to go about. Companies are not investing in productivity because instead they can get a bunch of cheap legal H-2A, cheap legal H-2B, cheap illegal immigrants, cheap labor coming in, the Cuba, Haitian, Venezuela, Nicaragua programs. These forms of cheap labor are preventing companies from making the types of investments that they need to make to have high productive
I know you want to respond to this, but I want to move on. Let me ask you something. Now, sometimes you guys talked about kind of a shared goal. Sometimes the left and the right come together and their motivations are completely different, right? I talked to Ken Buck, who's a former Congressman Ken Buck, who's an IOP fellow this quarter, very conservative guy, part of gone now, but he's in the Freedom Caucus. And he said his aha moment was when he was at a press conference with Mike Lee, Senator Mike Lee of Utah, and Bernie Sanders and Pramila Jayapal, who everybody knows is one of the most progressive members of Congress, on a press conference about war powers. And for him and Senator Lee, this was a constitutional issue, which talks about the president coming to Congress for permission to wage war rather than moving unilaterally or using prior war powers agreements. And the liberal end was there mostly with a more anti-war stance. I want to talk about that too, but I'll raise another issue on antitrust. On the right, there's been this longstanding view that the left is censoring conservative speech. The Amy Klobuchars of the world think that it's dangerous to democracy to have one person with that much strength in a tech business, for example. Different motivations, they come together. So I would love for you to take on either of those. We could start with war in that there does seem to be one area where the left and right have come together in interesting ways, and it has been the result of 20 years of not particularly successful global war on terror. Do you agree with that, or what's your observations?
Well, I think we wasted 20 years of treasury and blood and lives being distracted in the Middle East, and it's left us unprepared for the greatest threat that our nation faces in China. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. I'm probably not there with Ken Buck. I think the commander-in-chief needs the ability to conduct foreign policy. I think it's just beyond plausible that the United States Congress, which can barely get out of its own way, is going to be able to be nimble enough to take the types of votes that are necessary in a real crisis. But the way to keep the world safe is that we need America's allies to step up. And I think President Trump did a very good job of pressuring Europe to do more. I think that had President Trump been president, we wouldn't have had Putin invade Ukraine. I think if he had, you would have seen the Germans in Europe doing much more to provide resources into Ukraine, because it is not possible in the era where the unipolar moment is over for America to be focused on Asia, to pivot to Asia, as both the Obama administration has talked about, the Trump administration has talked about, the Biden administration has talked about, if we're also sucked into a long war in Ukraine and dealing with what we need to deal with in the Middle East.
Well, and to add to Michael, one of the things that bothers me, and I know Senator Sanders about particularly the defense budget, is that you've got an agency that takes $1 trillion, and there's no audit, it's rife with corruption. You know, does anyone know how much we pay for a Stingray missile? Does anyone know how much we pay for construction of a $2,000 bomb? No, this is one of the reasons why we fight over, let's say, Medicare negotiation. Why are we fighting for Medicare negotiation? Because the pharmaceutical industry used to charge whatever the hell it wanted to charge. And they wouldn't charge that to other people because they know no one could pay it, but they charge it to the government. The government can pay whatever they want. Here, you get $2,000 for this prescription drug. And for a long period of time, that's what Medicare would say, oh, here you go. So now we're changing that. Well, that's still going on at the Defense Department. That's how it works. Boeing just tells you, Lockheed, Raytheon, whatever, they just say, hey, this is the cost. How do we get to this cost? No one knows. And you got like an industry that's a revolving door that just decides that, hey, this is where everybody's inflating costs here. So how do we get to a $1 trillion defense budget that, by the way, then carries its own weight, right? When you get that level of scale and jobs and decides that much money, guess what? Oh, we actually have to stay in this war. We got to stay involved in trying to send bombs over there. We got to stay engaged in sending, because our industry now has become so involved in sending this money and weaponry across the world, when we need a transformation of how we think about it. And one of the ways we'd start about it is just circumspect about giving more of a role and authority to people of Congress, members who represent actual people, to say, I want to know, what do we spend this money on?
But I do want you to respond to what he said about our adventures in Afghanistan and Iran, because I don't want to lose sight of the fact that might have been a remarkable statement from a Republican 20 years ago, 15 years ago.
The modern Republican Party, you learn from where Donald Trump campaigned and said, the Iraq war was a disaster. To this day, when Dick Cheney comes out and Liz Cheney comes out, the reaction of the right is to mostly just, like they were wrong on Iraq. Like that's what most of them now say, despite the fact that it was them pushing that this was their agenda. And now it has become so disassociated where Donald Trump, like to this day, right? Guess which president in the United States was not at the Republican National Convention? Does anyone know? We've all forgotten him. George W. Bush. He's completely written him off. It's crazy, right? He's written off an entire Bush administration. The law doesn't exist anymore. And that's the modern Republican Party under Trump. They have moved in this direction. I just argue, it's not authentic to values of what they actually believe in, the record that they've held.
But isn't it also possibly true that Republicans and Democrats both see that it's a small percentage of American men and women who go to fight in these wars, right? A very small, mostly generational families. And there's been a recognition in both parties that that's not something that necessarily both parties want the country to be leaning into at this point. Can you imagine either president talking about boots on the ground anywhere right now?
Yeah, I think that there is a recognition on the right that we need to marshal our resources, that we literally, you have the CEO of Raytheon saying that in a shooting war with China, we can't produce munitions because our supply chains are so tied up with China. That's a huge problem. The fact that the right has now adopted a sense of figuring out how do we marshal our power, how do we rebuild the defense industrial base. I certainly think that procurement reform and making sure that the five primes aren't the only companies that can be engaged in the defense industrial base is a worthwhile goal. I don't see any introspection on the left, which now welcomes Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney as endorsers. Kamala Harris is proud to have Dick Cheney's endorsement when people on the left were calling him Hitler and Satan 10 years ago. I don't see any introspection of how do we marshal resources, recognizing that we have a national interest in Ukraine. It's not our most important national interest, but it is a national interest. And we are spending tremendous resources, recognizing that we have an interest in the Middle East, And just last week, we fired off every surface-to-air interceptor that we made in a year with regards to some munitions. And so I don't see where the recognition on the left that we live in a world of trade-offs, and that if we're serious about deterring China, we need to come to terms with those.
You don't think China's been a unifying force in the Democrats and Republicans and great powers competition?
I think the left speaks a good game on China. Right now, on the border of Nevada and Oregon, we have a lithium mine that could be built that could produce a tremendous amount of lithium, the core ingredient in batteries. If you're serious about the climate change agenda, if you're serious about the China agenda, you would want America producing lithium, refining it, engaging in metallurgy, and actually producing American batteries, which is the future of both of those things, and the left is tying it up in all sorts of environmental nonsense.
Well, let's push that to tariffs then, because there was a lot of complaining on the left about Trump's tariffs, and I noticed that President Biden kept most of them. Here's a quote from Kamala Harris recently. She said she would employ targeted and strategic tariffs to support American workers, strengthen our economy, and hold our adversaries accountable. Sounds a little MAGA to me. What about that? I mean, that's certainly an area where China's in the crosshairs of both parties.
Yeah, and the Biden administration is actually taking action on this. I mean, this is where you get, to my mind, a lot of this, there's some rhetoric, right? We sort through rhetoric, which some of your questions are around, but there's also policy. What are we actually doing about it? And one of the reasons why I appreciate some of the actions of the Biden administration, they do things. And recently, not many people know about it, but for a long period of time, China had used and exploited what was called a de minimis threshold to just ship cheap goods into the United States tax-free. Right? Just send it in tax-free. Anything under $800, you can send in any Amazon goods. Why we're getting in, you go on there, you search for something, you find something, it's sent to you as a piece of garbage. Right? How'd this happen? Because there's no quality control, no inspections, no desire to put up proper border security, and they've now started to take action. Could have been done for a long time, but now changing the de minimis threshold, looking and inspecting at these containers, making it clear that Shein and Temu can't just send in cheap shirts that compete.
It could have happened for a long time, except Democrats
they're
pulled their support on the de minimis. So China's de minimis threshold is $8. Should we lower ours to $8? Would you support that?
Should we lower?
Let's have fair trade with China. China has a de minimis standard of $8. I'd support lowering it to $8.
I would not. Why would you support lowering it to $8?
Our de minimis threshold, what they can send.
Guys, we can't talk about de minimis threshold.
So where rhetoric and policy matches up. So the Biden administration policy is to have a small garden and a tall fence with regards to China. What that means is that you have a vast global commons, all sorts of goods that allegedly it's fine, whether they're made in China, whether they're made wherever they're made, that we're going to have free trade in. And then there's a very small, narrow number of goods that are in our garden that we have to have a broad fence. I think it is totally naive to think coming out of COVID, to thinking with the military challenges that we face and the need to deter them, that we can have coupled relationships with China. And so when we're talking about tariffs, we should have tariffs. I think President Trump's right to call for a 10% across the board tariff. And it is fundamentally inconsistent with the United States and our interest and our ability to project power and deter war in China for us to have supply chains that are as wrapped up as they are currently.
But there's definitely been plenty of intersection. I mean, the attack on TikTok was completely and totally, almost shockingly bipartisan, to the point where we all wonder what people were hearing in the skiff about that, because that was surprising, probably.
Yes, on TikTok, we eventually got to the right outcome after much weeping and gnashing of the teeth.
Do you think it was the right outcome?
I didn't, yeah. So I was a break from Michael, and where people were, and I think Senator Sanders said this himself, I agreed with it, which is like, of all of the issues that we have with China, I think steel, aluminum, tariffs on bringing jobs back to America that we have lost and have been evaporated over decades and decades should be the core goal. It should be safety and security of the goods that come in. And a platform, to my mind, that delivers speech, I have a harder time with. I mean, the problem for me in that discourse is I don't feel like we were ever given a full understanding. And Michael may have, more privilege because Senator Rubio was on the Intelligence Committee, and there's more information. But at least what was publicly told to us about it, like, oh, they track your data. Okay, well, guess what? Let me tell you about 18 other companies online who also track your data. You wanted to know what are the specific harms that are uniquely impairing us, such that necessitate and require, this is the ACLU and me coming out, right? Such that requires a restriction on speech. Just because a company is foreign owned doesn't necessitate it. Now, what are the harms? What are the harms of a foreign owned company using a platform that is popular and used by lots of people? Why are we engaging in this restriction of speech in such a radical way?
Yeah. So TikTok's not just an espionage platform, it's also a propaganda platform. China owns the algorithm, it serves up what you see. If it wants to show us a bunch of pictures of, people eating unhealthy stuff and living unhealthy lifestyles, they can do that, and they can show other stuff in China. So that's the problem with TikTok.
I'm as bothered by Elon Musk, to be clear, I'm as bothered by Elon Musk doing the same thing with X. I know you may not feel that way, but I'm just saying, like Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, those are of equivalent concern to me.
I think there's huge issues on big tech. We should talk about issues with big tech. Fundamentally, the ACLU coming out in you. If it's not okay for the United States government to be regulating speech, the idea that the Chinese government, just because it's not our government, can have a platform that they put into this country that's deciding what you're served and what not. Look, there was an opportunity to sell TikTok. Why wouldn't the Chinese government sell it without controlling the algorithm?
Let's move on to big tech. And I want to talk about Lina Khan, who I'm finding a very fascinating figure, because she has lots of stands on the left and the right. And it seems, again, per this topic, what brings her fans together is the suspicion around big business, big finance, big tech, even if the reasons for those suspicions may differ. So let's talk some more about that. Where do you see, well, first of all, do you both think that this kind of skepticism about big tech is a left-right synthesized issue?
I think that it's probably a horseshoe issue. I think that the ruling elite of our country love the idea that they can make sure you don't see Hunter Biden's laptop, the idea that you don't get to be exposed to the lab leak theory of where COVID originated, which turns out to be true.
So censorship, you're talking about what you view as censorship.
Sure, but I think that the vast majority of the political center is perfectly happy with censorship. You had John Kerry, who's a current member of this administration, the other day saying that if Kamala gets reelected, they're going to have to look at the First Amendment to make sure it doesn't allow disinformation. Disinformation, like the true information that the China virus started in the Wuhan lab due to a lab leak.
And, so while I have similar censorship concerns as Michael, I go further, right? And I agree with where Lina Khan and the FTC have been, where Jonathan Cantor and the DOJ Antitrust Division have been, which is not just the censorship. What is fundamentally the problem there? The power of the companies, the power of the platform. They reach tens and tens of millions of people. If they could reach like 3,000 people, we'd be worried about them, right? The fact that Facebook controls what millions and millions of people see, read, and hear, that's fundamentally, it's gotten too big, and we live in an economy where everybody's at scale, right? You want to get to scale, get to scale, get to scale, get to scale. And that scale, going back to my earlier point of the power of government, it used to be that government was scale. That's why we cared about the federal government, because its scale was huge. That's not the case now. Google's power, Amazon's power, Facebook's power is at radically broader scales. And so then the derivative effects that Michael's talking about, yes, it could be that, it could be how they charge you a junk fee, it could be how they bind you to a non-compete clause, it could be how they bust your union, it could be how they suppress your pay, it could be a number of things that are all within the fact that they can do whatever the hell they didn't want because their power got too big. And that to me is the primary cause.
So is there agreement in there within that?
I think skepticism of consolidations of power is something that's a deeply conservative instinct.
And to borrow on that line, because I agree with it, is that the traditional conservative notions were that smaller government is better, right? The theory of smaller government, but also smaller diffusion of power in which we had smaller businesses. I agree with, right? Like, why do we want this? We don't want just general scale of big data. That becomes a serious concern because fewer people harbor the power to control what you can buy, see, hear, read, all that stuff. And it's a good thing for our society to have competition of engineering and having more people who can compete to sell you clothes, to develop social media platforms, all manner of business that sell you a sunglass. But right now, if you want to buy sunglasses, you're probably buying it from one or two companies. That's it. They create, like whatever the name of the Sunglass Hut is, no, it's one or two companies. That's it. That's all. That's where you're getting sunglasses. Why? And what is the result of that is that now if we go into like Omaha, Nebraska, or some small town anywhere in America, we're going to find that you can't be a small business owner who creates sunglasses because you're going to be crushed. They'll undercut you on price, throw you out of the market, and then they'll have the market all to themselves. It's changing American ethos, values, and literally our way of life in a negative way.
But do you agree, I mean, what is your response to the censorship complaint?
The consensus is an unproductive thing. If the consensus is demonstrably failing the country, as neoliberalism has failed our country, then it would be idiotic not to try to enact changes. So for the last 30 years, we've adopted a theory of governance, of economics really, that says that when people wake up in the morning and look in the mirror, they see a consumer first. And that the first role, therefore, of economics is to figure out how can we give people as much cheap stuff as possible. That if you're getting more, larger, cheaper, flat-screen TVs, you're flourishing as a person. That's demonstrably not true. At the same time, they said, Thomas Friedman said, no two countries with a McDonald's have ever gone to war together. Well, that's obviously not true right now if you look at Ukraine, but it revolved from a same kind of sense of commerce, of a concept, that commerce governs everything, and that 5,500 years of recorded human history and all the things that we know about humanity aren't true. And so neoliberalism has failed. It would be irresponsible, even if the middle of the horseshoe wants to keep walking down that path, to do so. And so I think it's very exciting. I have a lot of friends on the left who are on that part of the horseshoe, and obviously there's people on the right that are there. It's necessary if we want to continue to flourish as a society, which is not what we've been doing for the last 30 years.
And so I'll be on that left. I will agree with everything that Michael said. I will associate myself with everything he just said. And then the question becomes, what do you do about it? What do you do about it? And this is where I think the friction becomes, because this is where I am a huge fan of Lina Khan. I've known her for a long period of time, and she, those of you who don't know, she's the chair of the Federal Trade Commission. She's taken Amazon to court. She's trying to challenge the Kroger-Albertsons merger right now. She has fought prescription drug companies and PBMs. And this kind of government service is one of the reasons those of us love what Lina's doing, and there's a couple of others, but she's not alone. There's others who are doing similar work. But in the Biden administration, there's been these courageous warriors who have shown that the wielding of government authority against corporate power is the most critical thing to do. We have lost that power for 30, 40 years. Government servants have come in, and I've witnessed it, I'm sure Michael has too, where they come in and you know that they're thinking about their next job. They literally came in thinking, where am I going to go next? What's my network of the industries where I could go and work? And that incestuousness, that corruption, it has both subtle and explicit corruption on you. That I'm not here to challenge power, right? And when you start with that premise, you have allowed corporate power to call the rules of the road. They call the shots. You work for them. And finally, we're having that reason why she stands out and why she is being demonized, right? The Wall Street Journal editorial page, oh my God, like 100 editorials against her. They hate her. You get Mark Cuban, you've got, it's about almost if you look at the elites, I mean, it's Mark Cuban, it's Reid Hoffman, it's Barry Diller, it's the billionaires of America united. They're in solidarity, hate Lina Khan. Why? Because you're using government service to take on power. And I'm so, the attacks on her, in my view, and the attacks on antitrust, are less about trying to attack the agenda, which they don't like, is to dissuade other people, those of you in the audience who want to be the next Lina Khans. They don't want you to be that. Hold on, you're going to come in and you're also going to take the Department of Agriculture and wield power against agricultural monopolies? No, this is getting out of control. You're going to do it against the big banks who charge us exorbitant fees for credit card interest rates? No, whoa, slow down here. We don't want Lina Khan proliferation through this government. So we're going to attack her and make sure that no one feels like we want to associate with this kind of ideology, this type of mentality. And to my credit, this is where I give Biden incredible credit. He selected these people intentionally and purposefully who came in with this agenda and desire to fight power and on behalf of the public and working class people.
And so the interesting thing of all of that is of the people that are currently running for higher office, J.D. Vance is very clearly on the record about the great job Lena Khan is, and Kamala Harris has not committed to reappoint Lena Khan.
That is very interesting. That is very fair. We're going to move to questions in a few minutes. I think we're going to have microphones standing on both sides of the room. Look for them. Students, line up behind them right now. Start thinking of your questions. We want to be able for you to take advantage of these two wonderful guys who got on a plane and came to be with us today. So this is your chance to ask them what you'd like. So we'll get those mics set up and we'll turn to you in a second. I think I just want to kind of wrap my own thoughts around this and ask you to respond to one thing. I don't know how you identify. I'm ultimately an optimist about obviously this country, about this next generation, about what people can do when they come together. That's not demonstrated so well, at least for what we can visibly see in Washington. There's more that goes on behind the scenes, as you guys both know, that's not visible. But I guess what I wonder is if the far left and far right come together for the same motivations, for different motivations, but for things that they can agree in some way are toward the betterment of our country, do you think that is going to continue to happen? Do you think it's ultimately a good thing and a possible thing? Or do you think that ultimately it will be squashed by fundamental partisanship or other factors? I'd love you both to discuss.
To be clear, the reason it's happening, right, the reason why we're talking about some of this agreement is because actual people are in agreement. Let's not lose sight of that fact, right? Like there's tens of millions of people and they happen to be lower income working class people. There's not people with college degrees that didn't have, we're in a college audience, love college degrees, is great, but we're talking 2/3 of the American workforce without a college degree, people making under $100,000 a year who should not be left and feel disempowered, rightly so. They righteously angry about an economy that has left them behind. And when you're connected to that, when you feel that, when it is part of your ethos, when you get the inputs from this vast landscape of this wonderful country of that many people who are suffering and struggling and asking for help, it should rightly bring about what you are talking about, that there are people on the left and the right hearing that pain, hearing that struggle, and maybe responding to it slightly differently with different nuance or whatever, but at least hearing it and saying, I want to do something about it. And to the extent that they were not, you worry about you are living in your own freaking bubble, away and disparted from and too distant from the pain and suffering of tens of millions of people.
Yeah, I am optimistic. I think it's impossible to look at the record of failure of the last 25 years. I graduated high school in 2000. You have admission of China into the WTO, another thing that Bernie Sanders was prescient, as I believe a congressman at the time, in opposing. 9/11 and the subsequent long war in Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, the 2008 financial crisis, COVID, everything that we've lived through. It's impossible to look at all that and not come to the conclusion that we are in the process of wasting the greatest inheritance anybody has ever inherited, America. And I think that when you talk to, we were talking earlier today with some students at the University of Chicago, when you talk to Zoomers, when you talk to, on my side, pretty much anybody who was born and doesn't remember the fall of the Berlin Wall, we recognize that the system is not working. That doesn't mean free enterprise is broken. We need free enterprise. Free enterprise is the only system that actually allows the amount of prosperity and flourishing and broad-based success that we've enjoyed in the United States, but something needs to change. And I think there is an overwhelming consensus of people who have come of age over the last 25 years that something needs to radically change.
And I guess the last thing I would just ask real quick is, what's your message? We have a room full of young at heart. What is your message to them, anchored in this conversation about what they can expect should work toward in their public service journey and their journey as voters, their journey as Americans, in the context of what we've just discussed? Yeah,
get involved. I mean, this is the next 5-10 years is going to define the rest of this century in terms of whether America can kind of reorient our capitalism and enjoy the prosperity and the security and the broad-based flourishing that has been the norm in America for the last for hundreds of years, or not. Whether this is going to be an American century or a Chinese century, this is all deciding now. Don't waste that time at McKinsey or working at a hedge fund. Get involved and put your brains to good use.
See, a Republican just told you not to work at McKinsey. It's coming together, people.
I'll endorse that message.
1 minute.
Briefly, I would just, to add on to what Michael's saying, as you get involved, I would say, be constantly aware of your inputs. I see this happen with so many people. You get involved in politics, the influence of money, the influence of interest is always there. It pulls you like a gravitational force to a nicer, better, more comfortable world, disassociated from those for whom you're supposed to be fighting. And I think I see it happen to friends, good people. They're not evil people, they're good people. And you just become a little bit desensitized to actual people's struggles or the things that we could do that are bolder, that challenge industry. So constantly be mindful of your anchors and your inputs and how you get information, because I've seen in DC in particular and all kinds of, in New York, wherever, your inputs change. And suddenly the people who are in your inbox, the people who are in your text messages, the people who are adding you, they have influence. And then people inviting you to happy hours and fine, go to it. I'm not telling you don't enjoy your life, but don't lose sight of who you fight for, what you're trying to do.
The ultimate.
Unlike Faiz, I couldn't afford a tie, so I agree with what he said.
He's got this nice jacket. How much that cost you there?
Go to happy hour, the ultimate left-right agreement. You've modeled some great discourse on difference here. We appreciate that. We want that here on our campus. And you've also, I think, demonstrated the theory for some students and others who may not know how much left and right are together in some of these policy areas. Let's go to the smartest people in the room, our students over here.
Hi, I'm Vera. I'm a junior in the college studying economics and law, letters, and society. This was a really great conversation. I really learned a lot, so thank you for that. My question is about this issue of corporate power and conveniently pulls on kind of the last discussion you just had, but kind of this resurfacing of corporate greed and that being an issue for working class Americans and the antitrust discussions that we're seeing in the news now. And essentially my question is, where is this going to go next? And I'm thinking about J.D. Vance, comes from a venture capital background, but has largely agreed with everything that the Khan administration has been doing. And my question is, what does this issue of corporate power look like for the next presidency? In a Trump-Vance presidency, is this largely election rhetoric? Do you think something will continue pull on what the Biden administration has done? And what does that look like in a Harris presidency? What, where does the Khan FTC go from here, basically?
So look, I think we've talked about antitrust. Clearly, there's more of an acceptance of it on the right. I think that you'll have an FTC under a Trump administration that's more active than a traditional Republican. But I think it's wrong to think of corporate power as just an issue of antitrust. Take the issue of corporate ownership, for example. So 50 years ago, 75% of corporate stock was owned by actual individuals who lived in the community. Maybe it's a business owner, whomever. Today, 75% of corporate stock is owned by index funds, other forms of passive investing, foreign ownership, sovereign wealth funds. And so none of those entities are thinking of corporations as something that they have a duty as an owner to workers, to community, to country, any sort of sense of corporate patriotism, and to all the different people in the ecosystem. These are entities that overwhelmingly are just looking for a financial return, and that leave the management of the company to the managerial class that's in charge. And there's all sorts of issues that go in there. And so I think there's a whole host of issues that we can look at in terms of how capitalism has gone askew, how corporate power has gotten too large. And it would be a mistake to just say the only tool that we have here is to use the FTC and to file antitrust exemptions, while that is part of the picture. But instead, we need to fundamentally look at how has capitalism changed over the last 30, 50 years, and what do we need to do to change it, to bring it back into alignment with the common good of our country.
I love everything Michael said and agree with it. And one of the reasons that also to be mindful of is that FTC, when you get to the FTC as a FTC action, as much as I support it, it's almost like you've already failed, because the FTC is a legal agency filing a lawsuit to break something up as a last resort, as if like something didn't happen that should have happened. There should have been competition along the way, and we've gotten to a place where there's unfair methods of competition going on now, and so now as a last resort we've got to stop something, right? That's not what you want. You want to remake an economy in which market structures work. So as you think about housing in America, like we're getting a rise to everything that Michael was just talking about, institutional investors. You look at, there's a company called Invitation Homes that has 80,000 homes under its purview. 80,000 homes across America, single family renters. And what happens when you're a landlord? It's not like Michael upstairs. It's this company who I can't reach, don't know, who jacks me up on, doesn't return my security deposits as a business practice, and doesn't inspect their homes for safety, is not responsive to me. That's what happens. Right. So how far is this going to go? They're at 80,000 homes. Are they going to go to 500,000 homes? Are they going to go to 2 million homes? Is this where we're going? Is this the scale of an institutional investor? How do we fight that on the front end? And I think that the actions where Lina Khan is doing nationally, I think is starting to, rightly so, bleed locally. That's where the fights are, right? When you think about attorney generals across the state, also just people who are at the county level who are thinking about market structures in their head. As you're giving out money, right? Who are the people who've traditionally benefited? Or are we creating ordinances that allow and ensure that there's competition locally? Like if I see in reaction to Airbnb having too much power over certain markets, you've seen local ordinances pop up. In reaction to Dollar General having too much power over certain local companies, you see local ordinances pop up and say, hey, no, we want some small businesses here. No, we want to control our rental market. We want to control our housing market such that there's competition and lifeblood. I think that's where the fights are going to be, actually.
I can't see over here because it's a very bright light, but I'm going to assume there's a human
There's
being
somebody, yeah.
in front of a microphone.
Yeah.
And so go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Alan. I'm a first-year master's student in the university. And my question is, recent years in Europe particularly, we saw the rise of political parties that are culturally right but economically left. What implications might you see of these, and do you think there's any potential in America where parties adopt this merging between left and right, culturally and economically different? Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think the overwhelming issue in Europe, as in the United States right now, is mass migration. You can code that cultural, you can code it whatever it wants. People are going to the polls time after time after time and saying this is an issue that we think is changing our opportunities as workers, is changing the cultures of our countries, and is something that we have no say on. And every time we go to the polls and try to have a say, we get told by the elites, well, you're not going to get that outcome. That the only unacceptable outcome is an end to the mass migration of low-wage, low-skill workers. And so I think I think eventually I hope that eventually the will of the people will be respected. I think that is clearly what's going on in Europe. It's clearly what's going on in the United States. And that does provide an opportunity for a party that wants to be more in the normal range of economics and culture, which is what voters are asking for.
I want to make sure we get to other questions. Did you want to respond to that at all?
No,
All right, let's go over. Go here.
Hey, I'm Arthur. I'm a second-year undergrad. I'm studying biology and economics. My question was, well, first of all, I thought it was a really enlightening conversation. I appreciate both perspectives. I understand all the arguments that Michael's made tonight about the new rights view of corporate power. But what confuses me is the rights embrace of certain billionaires like Peter Thiel with J.D. Vance and Elon Musk, but the rejection of other billionaires, like seen through Josh Hawley's hearings where he eviscerates McKinsey CEOs and big tech corporations. And I was just kind of wondering if you can explain the consistency on the right in that regard, and whether that truly means that there is a change as for the Republican Party at large.
Well, I don't know that it's a question of this billionaire is good, that you can't have billionaires who agree with you on certain policy areas, which is, I think, what Elon and Peter Thiel do. Look, McKinsey is a company that has reportedly produced a list for the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia of who his critics are. That's the Crown Prince who murdered Jamal Khashoggi, which held a corporate retreat a mile away from the Xinjiang concentration camps, which worked on China's Made in 2025 industrial policy, and which had absolutely no firewalls between the work that they did for the FDA of the United States and the Sacklers and the companies purveying the opioid crisis. And so I think McKinsey is 100% an untrustworthy company that Senator Hawley was, and it's not just Senator Hawley, it's Senator Blumenthal, the Democrat from Kentucky, from Connecticut, a little bit different, was the chairman of the subcommittee on investigations that called, I don't know if it was that hearing, but also called McKinsey in. And so, look, I agree with some of the things that Elon supports. I disagree with some of the things that Elon's done vis-a-vis China and Tesla. I think Peter Thiel has a lot of important and interesting ideas that he's put into our discourse. And I think McKinsey is just fundamentally an evil and unpatriotic company.
Over here.
Hi, thanks for the conversation. My name is Pam Nogales. I'm one of the postdocs here. I'm a fellow in the social sciences. I wanted to ask about the political realignment of both parties. So one thing that you both agreed on is that neoliberalism and its policies haven't worked for the American people. And this seems to be a common agreement that's resulting in some interesting transformation of both parties. So if I could just present a thesis and maybe have you correct it or add to it, that there seems to be a breakup of the old Reagan coalition that came from the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s, which was a coalition of neoliberals, that's within the Republican Party, neoliberals, neoconservatives, strict construction constitutionalist conservatives, and evangelical Christian fundamentalists. Now that is now uneasy and things have broken up. The absence of Bush maybe at the RNC is one way in which we can see that this has changed. How has this changed in the Republican Party? What are the forces that you see moving out of it? And on the Democratic Party side, it seems like you had this McGovernite, sort of Clinton neoliberal coalition that now has been challenged by progressive voices, and you have Cheney coming to the Democratic Party. So for some of us that grew up in that era where Cheney was presented as Hitler, Satan, et cetera, it's a very strange situation. And I just wonder, what sense could you make out of this? What are the shifting forces? Have they found new homes? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm not to correct all of the terms that you used in your description of our coalition, which I wouldn't agree with. Clearly there is a shifting in the coalitions. Clearly the three-legged stool fusionism that was associated with Ronald Reagan is changing. I think Ronald Reagan's legacy is misunderstood in the common telling. So Ronald Reagan saved the American auto industry by slapping tariffs on Japanese cars, which forced Japanese companies to move their plants here, to move the supply chains here, to move the R&D facilities here. There were points in, I believe, the 1990s that Japanese automakers were the largest makers of American cars, exceeding the big three. And so I don't think that Ronald Reagan was a neoliberal. Ronald Reagan was somebody who had a deep and abiding love of the free market, which I share, and applied that love of the free market and belief in peace through strength and other principles to the unique challenges that existed in America in 1980. And the mistake that my side has made for the ensuing 44 years is just assuming that being a principled conservative meant repeating the prescriptions that made sense in 1980 over and over and over again. You saw 16 people who broadly did that in different ways in 2016 lose to Donald Trump, who said something different. So the coalitions are changing, but I also would urge you against over-accepting the mythology of Ronald Reagan as some Goldwaterite libertarian, which just wasn't his record.
Somehow we got this far without talking about Robert Bork and the Chicago School of Economics.
I
was just going to say on the point, I mean, we have to separate what is honestly going on. There's not like an ideological coalition going on with Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. Like what is going on is clear. It's easy. It's simple, right? Like they don't like Donald Trump. There's a voting behavior issue. It's A versus B in this election. A or B. People don't like Donald Trump. Raise my hand. I'm there. Whoever's up, I'll vote for that person. I'm there. Kamala Harris, great. I'm with her all the way. We're going to do whatever we can to get her elected. It's good for America's democracy and America in general. So sure, that's going to happen. But does that mean that everybody, like think of how many people across America are going to vote against Donald Trump? There's lots of different ideological viewpoints. I think what we're trying to offer is a policy prescription for the direction that we want to do that's distancing itself from voting behavior, right? People who vote for a lot of different reasons. There's going to be a lot of people who I agree with, sadly, who are going to vote for Donald Trump, like, to be honest with you, right? And that doesn't mean, like, actually like if I was talking to those folks, I probably would find myself 95% in agreement with them. And yet they're going to vote for Donald Trump. So I think it's important to separate these two and not overread the idea that, well, because you voted in an A versus B election, that it must, everything has radically changed in our ideological views. No, it's just, that's the choices, and people rightly make the choices for whatever reasons they want.
Over here.
Hi there. My name is Rishabh. I'm a first-year MP candidate, Master's in Public Policy at the Harris School of Public Policy here. So kind of going back to our war powers conversation you guys both have. And first of all, I want to thank you both for being here. Like, I really appreciate that conversation you guys had. It seems that there are factions on both sides of the aisle that agree that the United States has misplaced its priorities in terms of its foreign policy by spending so much on military assistance abroad and arms exports, et cetera. in regards to that conversation, do you think that bipartisan consensus can extend to a reduction or cessation in arms sales and military assistance to Israel?
No. So I think Israel is an ally of the United States that exists in the Middle East, that has enemies led by Iran that want to drive it into the sea. I don't think that they're going to drive it into the sea by marching troops across the border tomorrow. I think they're going to do it by making it fundamentally impossible to want to live in Israel because you fear terrorist attack, because you fear military action, because you feel that investment isn't safe, and that is a long-range strategy that Iran, which like China and Russia, wants to disrupt the status quo in the world, is using its proxies and Hezbollah and Hamas to enact. And so I think that America stands with Israel. I think America is right to stand with Israel, and I think that should continue to mean sending it arms.
I'll be quick. I mean, obviously, I have disagreement with Michael strongly on that one. And, Israel has a right to defend itself and a good ally, but Netanyahu is not. And you have a right to defend yourself against a heinous 10/7 attack, but you don't have a right to go bomb every school, every hospital, demolish a civilization, and 40,000 lives of the Palestinians, disrupt any ability for them to live. And there should be some accountability when that happens. There should be America, who is the greatest purveyor of arms to Israel, can and should use that power to change the nature of how the Netanyahu regime is operating. We should not be using American taxpayers' funding to support activities, whether it's Netanyahu or anybody else, doing these kinds of heinous activities. You can still be an ally. I mean, how many of us live in families in which we love our wife, love our sons, love our children, and yet you are absolutely freaking wrong about this. And there will be accountability and there'll be actions for this, and yet I will love you tomorrow. Of course, we can handle both of those things.
Just to get in the spirit of the question, though, you both have just given different positions on that issue that are greatly articulated in our country right now. But I think in the spirit of the question, can you imagine, for example, if Israel was looking for actual boots on the ground support, or within the America First construct, not wanting to give certain support to Israel in the same way from the same folks who don't want to give support to Ukraine. Do you see at any point in the future a left-right alliance around some area of military support for Israel?
Well, I don't think Israel's asking for any American boots on the ground, so I think kind of the premise
But what
of the
about
question,
arms shipments, though?
I answered the question about arms shipments.
You don't
Look,
think so?
this all stops when Hamas stops using hospitals and schools to stage attacks on Israel, when Hamas stops attacking Israel, when Hezbollah stops attacking Israel.
It doesn't have to be in
clearly
Israel, by the way.
this clearly is not part of the horseshoe.
Boots on the ground don't have to be just be in Israel to be fighting against Iran proxies. But do you ever see that?
No, I mean, I think Michael appropriately characterized the Republican position, and therefore there aren't many abilities to persuade him.
I think we have time for one more. I can't remember which side. Over here is the side we need to go to next. I believe.
Young at heart, class of '88, college, global history thesis. My question is, in 2015, Bernie Sanders said open borders was a Koch brothers proposal, and Trump also campaigned in 2015, 2016, hire America, hire first. Now, fast forward 8 years later, we have open borders, Kamala Harris, and we have Trump wanting to staple a green card to every foreign grad student. These young people want to have a good job when they graduate. How can you help them with this horseshoe, hopefully make American citizens first in line for jobs and help these young people who might have to compete with every foreign student coming here with a stapled green card that Trump diametrically opposed, I think, in 2016.
That's always been an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, look, I think stapling a green card is an idea that sounds good in theory. I think that when you actually look at how it's going to play out and colleges popping up to give out diplomas and what types of H-1As are actually coming in and what those green cards mean. So I agree with the sentiment of your question.
But I also think, I mean, you might disagree with it, is that legal immigration continues to be an important asset and value to American society. We should not lose that thread. I get that there can be abuse, and they obviously don't want illegalities at play here. But I do think, at least from my perspective, maybe disagree, is that we still want increased flow of legal immigration to this country. It's been such a lifeblood for us that I feel like we lose that thread, and suddenly we're all just talking as restrictionists.
If you can ask a question in 30 seconds and these guys can answer it in 1 minute, you can get the last word.
Hello, I'm Oliver Heatley, first-year student planning on studying political science or economics. My question is, both presidential candidates are planning policies that will further increase the U.S. government deficit and debt, which is already historically very high. What's something each of you would do to reduce that, or do you not see it as an issue?
I think it's a gigantic issue. I think we're in the midst of the debt crisis. I think that there's all sorts of ideas that should be put on the table, including revenue increases. I know that Senator Sanders supports a financial transactions tax. That's something that I think is worth looking at. And so I think revenues absolutely need to be on the table. I think that Democrats need to put spending cuts on the table also. It's actually been interesting as we've been involved in some conversations over the last year or so about an increased willingness from Republicans, which is real. I mean, Chip Roy, the policy director of the Freedom Caucus, has said that he thinks corporate tax rates may need to go up. The chair of the House Budget Committee has said that he thinks revenues need to be on the table. I hear lots of ideas about college for all and Medicare for all and so on and so forth. Occasionally you'll get a Democrat who says that he wants to cut defense spending, but I don't hear a lot of very practicable, serious spending cuts that actually come from the Democrat side of the aisle these days.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to head into a tax debate at the end of 2025, regardless of who the next president is, because that's when the Trump tax provisions will sunset, some of them, and we are going to have this debate, and that would be a core part of the revenue raising. And I mean, I'm sure we could talk about, I have no problem finding spending cuts, and we could go through very specific areas. Defense Department's obviously an easy one, but even within the broader outside Defense Department, I don't think it'd be too hard to identify areas where we find waste, fraud, and abuse. But I think the revenue raiser, to my mind, is the biggest issue in American society right now. You have the wealth and income inequality is so huge, and I know I'm largely stating something that Republicans don't tend to agree with, which is the corporate rate is not the effective corporate rate. Like whatever that number is, that's not what they're paying. Right, and so I think as much as we want to talk about the rates, and we will talk about rates, the bigger problem is the loopholes and the abuse of the tax system in which people who claim you're supposed to pay 15, 20, 25, 30%, not paying that. They're not paying that, they're paying zero, right? They're paying close to zero, right? I mean, Trump himself was an example of this category. And obviously there's ways in which, if you do business investments, and sure, there's ways in which you can say, okay, reduce the tax rate, but that's not what's going on in society right now. All working class people know they are paying higher effective tax rates than the wealthiest people in our society, and that has to change.
And so just to put a point on it, we're not going to solve the debt crisis unless Democrats are willing to come to the table with more than waste, fraud, and abuse.
Well, on that note, this has been a very interesting conversation. We never take for granted people's time. That's the greatest gift you can give, and we so appreciate that you gave it to the University of Chicago and the Institute of Politics tonight. And I thank all of you for coming out, and I hope you see you on Thursday and many, many nights at our speakers events throughout the fall. And thank you both so much.